Good day, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar on this Public School Week in America. This is a great opportunity for us to celebrate our schools, our communities, the great job that our teachers do, that our administrators do, the way that parents feel about their schools, how they love their neighborhood school, how they love the education that their children are getting. This is important that we do celebrate and that we acknowledge the great work that public education does in America in these rather turbulent times. And to help us with that discussion, we're welcoming Becky Pringle. Becky is the president of the National Education Association, and which is, by the way, the nation's largest union. And she's also a middle school science teacher for 31 years of classroom experience. Becky, how great to have you with us today. I think you need to unmute.
Now, Dan, you know I was already on top of that, see? Oh, it is so good to be here with you. And thank you so much for including in my introduction that I am a middle school teacher. I taught science for over 30 years. Actually, I taught middle level students science for over 30 years. And it is at the core of who I am and everything I do. It is so great to be with you this day as we kick off Public Schools Week. I am so excited for the work we will do together this week and all of the people we will ask to join us in lifting up our public schools. Whatever affects one directly affects all. Indirectly, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of our reality. Dr. King's words remind us why we are here this week, joining together as a collective to put public schools in the spotlight, to be clear that our schools are the foundation of this country. They are the way we ensure that every student, everyone, has the access and opportunity and supports that will allow them to be who they ought to be, that will allow them to live into their magnificent brilliance. As we begin this important week, it's so important to recognize the essential role of our public schools, the role that they have played throughout history. Our public schools are centers of learning, for sure. But they're also centers of health and wellness for our students and their families. They're also centers for their social and emotional development. At their best, our schools are the heart of our communities. That is why the 3 million members of the National Education Association are so dedicated to creating the safe, just, and equitable learning environments that every single one of our students needs and deserves. Over the last two very difficult, I'm struggling with another word, challenging, difficult. There's just not an adequate word to describe these last 2 years. But as we've all watched, educators literally wrapping their arms around our students. And in so doing, they have bolstered our public schools to ensure our students could continue to learn, to make sure our students and families have access to healthy meals. We saw that every day, and making sure that they had all of those other resources from connectivity to clothing, to housing, all of those supports. Our public schools help to provide so our students can be successful. Last week, over 99% of our school buildings were open for in-person learning. That didn't just happen. That's because of the dedication, commitment, and resilience of educators. Our educators should be revered. Yet, because of the lack of respect for our professions, we face acute and chronic shortages in schools all across this country. That respect encompasses educators' professional responsibility to build safe, equitable, and healthy learning environments. That necessarily means we must ensure honesty in education. Our students deserve to know the truth about our nation's history, its triumphs, as well as its tragedies. As president of the NEA, my vision of the NEA will be that we will not only unite our members, but this entire nation to lead a movement to reclaim public education as a common good, as that foundation of this democracy, and then transform it into something it actually was never designed to be. A racially and socially just and equitable system that prepares every student, everyone, to succeed in this diverse and interdependent world. Our students are depending on us to create a public school system that is worthy of them. That is why this week is so important. And I look forward to today's conversation. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Becky. And our next guest is Carol Lee, who's a professor emeritus of education in the School of Education and Social Policy and in African American Studies at Northwestern University. And she's also president of the National Academy of Education. Carol, what a great pleasure to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you, Becky, as well. I too am an educator who has taught at every level. I've actually taught for 56 years. I've taught high school, primary school, city college, and the university. I'd like to come at this celebration of public education and to suggest to our audience that they may go to the National Academy of Education's website and download a report that we've just completed on educating for civic reasoning and discourse. And in that report, we basically argue that public education, drawing in part on Amy Gutman's book, Democratic Education, is the only space in a democracy where we can require that young people have experiences to prepare them for participating in the complex civic challenges in our democracy. And we argue in that report that the range of knowledge that young people need to develop includes clearly an understanding of governmental systems and political systems, et cetera. But beyond what we typically think about as civics, also requires developing deep conceptual knowledge across all of the disciplines. For example, the challenges that we're facing right now in these 2 years of the pandemic, where people making individual decisions and influencing policy around how we respond to this virus, and to interpret the variety of kinds of data that people are getting, need to understand about viral mutations, need to understand about viral spread, need to understand about the probability of reasoning, need to be able to interpret the myriad data displays that they are bombarded with, every day, of trying to make sense of what's going on in this pandemic and how they should try to adapt to it. In addition, they need to develop an epistemological orientation of valuing complexity. We are facing very complex times with very complex sets of issues along all dimensions. The challenges that Becky referenced around these contestations about how our history should be taught, et cetera. these challenges coming around, banning of books, etc., that when people think that when you're faced with complex problems, that simple solutions work, that's a challenge. They also need to develop ethical reasoning that are attached to democratic values, where we are paying attention clearly to the opportunities that living in a democracy provides for our individual rights, but also that we have to balance that with the consideration of our fellow citizens and the others with whom we share both living on this land and in the world itself. And then dispositions to value complexity, to consider multiple points of view, to weigh evidence. So we believe that public education is a sacred space in which, in a democracy, all young people have access to resources that will both fulfill the traditional technocratic aims of education, preparation for the workforce, right? Preparation for professions, etc. But equally important, preparation for the development of the whole child, socially, emotionally, physically. Children spend, in many cases, more time in schools than they do even with their families. If you think about the majority of the day, during the week, so that social, emotional well-being and health is necessary for robust learning. And finally, that public school is that space to prepare them to engage with these persistent challenges. The challenges that we're facing right now, if we truly understand our history, are not new challenges. Every generation from the beginnings of this country have wrestled in some way or another with the question of individual rights versus group rights, with what's the scope of authority for the federal government versus the state versus local authorities. So none of these are new. We've certainly had contestations over our history and how it's to be taught, what's to be included in the curriculum. We've certainly, unfortunately, experienced pandemics before. So, and that we live, particularly today, in an interdependent world with complex technologies that young people can experience really the world at the tip of their hand just with access to digital resources. So public education has a very special role in the ability of our country to sustain this delicate and complex experiment that we have. I will conclude by saying that one of the things that is particularly, I think, important, we certainly think about this, the National Academy of Education is an honorific society, if you will, of scholars and researchers working across multiple disciplines in the field of education. In addition to our COVID report, civics report, we also have a report out on education during the COVID pandemic that can also be useful for multiple audiences. We need, if we are taking the challenges and the wonderful opportunities, really the moral and ethical opportunities that we have through public education, have to make sure that we're thinking about developing these robust opportunities for our children from an ecological perspective. So it has to do with resources in communities. It has to do with how professionally we prepare people to go into the profession of teaching. So, Becky, if you compare the preparation of teachers in the United States versus other parts of the world, it's quite a different experience. Teachers in parts of the world where nations outperform us on international assessments, teachers are not in classrooms all day. Teachers have professional communities that are built into their work life. Teachers in Finland are paid what doctors and engineers are paid. Doctors and engineers in Finland don't make what they do in the United States, but it says a lot in terms of equitable pay. So there's, and also other parts of the world don't test the way that we do, and yet outperform us in terms of international assessments. So there are many dimensions of being able to take up this awesome ethical, moral, if you will, responsibility we have in building and sustaining public education as a resource to prepare our young people for holistic development, for personal fulfillment, and to prepare them for the complex demands of citizenship.
Thank you very much, Carol. I'm Dan Domenech, by the way. I am the executive director of the American Association of School Administrators, and we represent school superintendents at the national level. And we just had our national conference this past week in Nashville. And we were honored to have had the Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, there. And we did a little chat, a fireside chat on stage in front of about 4,000 school superintendents that were in attendance. And I asked him, my first question to him is that this week, Mr. Secretary, is Public School Week. What will you say to the audience? And these are his remarks, our video of Secretary Cardona.
Thank you, Dan, for the introduction. Thanks also to everyone with the Learning First Alliance. Your commitment to our nation's public schools is inspiring. I want to start by acknowledging how difficult these past 2 years have been. Through it all, you've brought your best every day to students. With dedication, flexibility, and resilience, you've put students' success at the center of all you do. Throughout our nation's history, we've seen that public education in a democracy does more than serve the public. Education empowers us to strengthen our communities and our democratic society, where anyone with dreams and determination can do and become anything they choose. We've always known this, but over the past 2 years, it's been even clearer. Our schools are our students' communities. And when public schools become hubs for families and for community engagement, when they offer rigorous, relevant learning experiences, and when they provide wraparound services that support the whole child, our students thrive. Since day one, the Biden administration has invested in the power of education. With support from the American Rescue Plan, states and districts are ensuring schools can remain open for in-person instruction, where we know students learn best. American Rescue Plan funds are also helping to transform education, ensuring that all children have their social, emotional, mental health, and academic needs met. New proposed investments in the full-service community schools program would help serve more than 2 million students and families in an estimated 800 new schools. This would be a game changer. I believe this is our moment to heal and to recover from the challenges caused by the pandemic and confront the inequities that existed long before it. Together, we can create safe, equitable, and engaging public schools for every student in every community. To fulfill America's values of equality, justice, and prosperity, our public schools need to work for every child. Let's continue to champion public schools and an equitable, excellent education for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Cardona. So that's a great message, and we appreciate his bringing that message to us at our beginning of Public School Week. So, Becky, Carol, one of the things that I've been impressed with over the last couple of weeks, and Becky, you have done some of these surveys as well, that it's even recently, after all of the things that have been going on, the surveys continue to show that when parents are asked to rate how they feel about their public schools, over 70%, close 75, 76% consistently love their teachers. They love their principals. They love their neighborhood school. That has been a consistent process for all those years that the Gallup poll was doing the annual poll. And even most recently, we still continue to get those results, that there's tremendous support for public education at the grassroots level. Yet when we see what's going on, and when we see the chaos that's created, and when we see the boards of education that are truly unruly, when we see the stress that our superintendents, our principals, our teachers, all of our education workforce is under, it's hard to reconcile these two things. How can that be if there's that kind of love and support still for our schools and for public education? Why does it seem every time that we pick up a paper that that's not the case? That all of a sudden educators have become the enemy and under attack? Becky, Carol?
So honestly, Dan, it was at the very end of what you said is in part the answer. When people pick up the paper, if they still do that, but whether they are getting online or they are consumed by that echo chamber of fear mongering and divisiveness, of false. Making false accusations and narratives around what's actually happening in our public schools. We'll look back on this time. There'll be lots of time to really do a deep analysis of the impact of this pandemic, just all aspects of the pandemic. But as an educator, this, Dan and Carol, it's like a core value for us, right? To continuously learn. So we're already digging into it. And what does it mean? And what have we learned? What will we bring forward? What we allow to come forth? What will we, change after these 2 years? And you're right, Dan. One of the things that hasn't changed has been so consistent, and it doesn't seem to make sense. But I tell you what, when we think about how during the pandemic, when in the throes of it, March of and April of 2020, when all of our schools went virtual, and our parents and community members and others were actually in our classrooms, and they were watching and they were seeing exactly what those surveys reveal year after year after year, that our parents not only trust their public schools and their public school teachers and bus drivers, the people greet them the first thing in the beginning of the day, and the secretaries that welcome to the school, the food service workers that feed them, the counselors, the principals and superintendents. But they also understand the important role they are playing. They also see educators going above and beyond the call of duty. We've always known that teachers take money out of their pocket to pay for extra supplies, but America didn't actually see all of those other supports. Educators standing in the gaps for students who were living in poverty, who didn't have a secure place to live, that weren't eating, and their families that weren't eating. We were seeing that, right? We were seeing middle school students eating only half of their lunch and packing half of it to go home with them. We were seeing that every day as educators. But America started to see that over these last couple of years. And our parents know it. And they've always known it, that our public schools were taking care of their kids and taking care of them. Educators were not only having office hours for their students, but their parents were saying, can you stay on? Could you give me an office hour? And they were staying on, Dan. They were staying on, Carol, until 10 o'clock at night, working with parents and going through that math lesson, or just listening, just creating space to listen. So that, because parents are struggling with their students' mental health and their emotional health, all of that, Carol, that you were talking about, the parents were struggling with that, right? And they were reaching out to educators, and they were there. So that's why you're not seeing a change, Dan, because we're doing what we've always done. Just America's watching, and all that we're seeing on TV, or if we pick up a paper, looking at in the paper, all of that, it's not what's happening in the vast majority of our public schools and communities and school boards across this nation.
That's a great point, Becky, and because it is a minority, unfortunately, but it's what we constantly read about and don't recognize that indeed 90% of our public, of our parents, are still very supportive of our schools. Carol, would you weigh in on this?
Yes. So I think the challenge between the disconnect between what's seen in the media and what's represented in the polls, again, goes back to the argument I was making about the demands of citizenship in a complex society such as ours. because we have so many forms of media that are so accessible, the ability to critically examine sources of authority, sources of bias, attention to particular points of view, and to some degree the capital, incentives in the media of attending not so much to the ordinary, but the extraordinary. I think, Becky, you're absolutely right that for the majority of schools, particularly neighborhood schools, where schools are situated, in neighborhoods, parents walk their kids to the school building. I think this pandemic has very much heightened for both teachers and for families the sort of interdependence of supporting the whole child and the whole family. And I think that certainly has intensified the respect for public schooling. At the same time, while the challenges that we see in the media at public school, public, board meetings, with these very heated debates about what should be taught in school, also can't be ignored on two dimensions. One is what some of these parents are fighting against about the teaching of history. One are based on perceptions in many cases rather than reality, but it is still a challenge that across our public school systems, we really don't have adequate attention to the full scale and breadth of our history and the history of the world and the ways in which communities are interdependent and the power of understanding the ways in which the system of governance that we have developed in this country allows for these contestations to take place. There are plenty of places in the world where you can get up and do that in a board meeting. But we do need to be able, and the other problem with these challenges that are arising is that they're not only arising about the content of curriculum, but they also, and I'm sure NEA, Becky is very concerned about this, have involved physical attacks on teachers and principals and school board members. And so this whole issue that I was talking about earlier about public education as the site where you socialize a disposition to listen to others, even when you disagree with them, to understand that there are pathways in the society for you to reconcile and come to some set of compromise. There's something about that kind of disposition toward democratic discourse, if you will, that is not evident in the way in which these particular communities of parents are raising these issues around what they think is critical race theory, which isn't what they think it is, and particularly onerous is this banning of books. And we have had a history of that. This is not new at all in our society. So on the one hand, I think it is essential and healthy all the time, certainly in this week, to acknowledge the powerful role that public education plays and the kind of important, meaningful relationships that teachers develop with children and their families, but also not to ignore, even though it is not the majority, it's a minority. It is a real challenge, and it's a cancer, I think, that reflects some underlying tensions in the society that we have not been able to resolve, that we need to be able to create venues to talk through and to understand from our history how we have addressed those challenges in the past.
That's a great point, Carol. And it brings to mind that, when this pandemic first started, teachers were heroes, like medical personnel. I mean, everybody loved their teachers and what they were doing, that they worked that they were doing. Parents who, because of the remote learning, found themselves often having perhaps to play the role of teacher in the classroom. All of a sudden, my God, How can a teacher be in a classroom with 25 or 30 kids for a whole day when I can barely do it with just my 1 or 2 children that I have in school? So it was this great feeling and this great recognition and acknowledgement of the work that the teachers were doing in the classroom for kids. And even today, I think that what we see happening in the schools is the tremendous engagement that teachers are playing out with the students in their class, that they are more concerned, and rightfully so, with the social and emotional well-being of the children, first and foremost, than necessarily the academics. Not that the academics are not important, but we are seeing a behavior situation with our students coming back to school now that is serious. The behavior problems throughout the schools. And now, of course, we're also beginning to see the return of children being shot in schools by adults or by other children. So we're back in a situation where I think it's reflective of what's happening in our society, the stress that everybody is under, and so are our children. And so when they're coming to school, the teachers are focusing on the need of their children. They want to take care of the needs of our children. They want to embrace them. They want to do what they need to do. But at the same time, as you know, Becky, we're faced with a huge teacher shortage. We're faced with, when I talked to my superintendents this past week and I asked them, what's your biggest problem? Their biggest problem is keeping schools open, not because of the pandemic, but because they don't have enough teachers to man or supervise the classrooms. So we need to move forward in this direction with the issue that we have now by recognizing not only that the work that teachers are doing to support our kids, but how do we support our teachers in the classroom so that they can continue to do that? What are some of the things, Becky, that you're looking at and thinking of as we move in that direction?
So I should have said this from the start. Carol, it is such an honor to be on this panel with you. I could talk to you for the rest of the day. I'm just sitting here writing notes down, and I'll give you credit the first couple times, and I'll just say I heard somebody say, and then I'll have said it. You know how that goes. It's such an honor to be with you, and there's something that Carol, she's being very consistent, so I hope everyone's listening. She keeps using this word over and over again: complexity, especially in education. You know, we've suffered through decades and decades of everyone who ever went to school thinking they know what to do about schools, about teaching and learning, people who are elected or appointed, making decisions about our students, instead of creating the kind of professional atmosphere that Carol described earlier that we see in other countries, where it demonstrates their respect of the profession from what they are paid, comparable to other professions, to actually how they use their time, where their time is used for the collaborative, the collective autonomy within the profession, their collaboration across, the opportunity to continue to learn, all of those things. And so when we think about the educator shortage, you know, Dan, I've been traveling throughout the country since last July on what I call my Joy, Justice, and Excellence tour. I just wanted to go around the country and listen to our educators and students and parents and community members, our superintendents, principals, nurses, all of them talk to me about what this last year has been for them. And because we always, no matter what, we always see these islands of excellence with just incredible things that are happening. I wanted to dig into that a little bit and learn a little bit more about what they were doing around ensuring education justice. And I knew when I've been traveling from California to Kentucky, and I knew there was a problem. I didn't know how bad it was, honestly, because this is chronic. This is not new. It's not new. We've had educator shortage. NEA, we've actually been doing an analysis for, I want to say about a decade and a half, of the number of college students who were going into teacher preparation programs. And so it's been on this steady decline. And we know that it, like with everything else, the numbers are disparate when we talk about students of color making that choice to go into education, and then they are leaving at a disproportionate rate too. So it's just exacerbating the issue we have around the diversity of our profession. So, it's not that we didn't know there was a problem, but I have to be honest with you, when NEA did our survey, I was shocked. I honestly was when it was 55% of our educators were planning on leaving the profession. I was, and it was those that were in the beginning years from year 1 to 8, in the middle years, 10 to 20, and then those who were close to retirement, they were saying they were willing to give up the additional money they get in their pension because they just couldn't do it anymore. I was shocked that 55% was across the board, but for Black teachers, it was 62%. For Latino teachers, 59%. So we saw that difference in our teachers of color. And so as we talk to them about the why or what would allow them to stay, we're not shocked, right? They talk about educator pay, something Carol talked about. And it's not people, they always translate that into the greedy teachers. Really, seriously, I mean, no. Nobody went into teaching because of the apples they get every day. We never did that. But America was shocked 2 years ago when we saw that Red for Ed movement sweep the country, and they saw teachers living in their cars. Living in their cars, Carol, we saw it. We saw people who nurture our kids every day, whose own students were on free and reduced lunch. That's not okay. It's not okay. In this, the richest country in the world, you've got to be kidding me. So of course that came up. And do you know what the second thing that came up, Dan? It was something you said earlier. Our students' mental health, our educators are worried about, and they realize, wait a minute, I've been standing gaps for everything, but I don't have the time or the training to provide the mental health services that my students need. And they need it right now. And then they talked about needing more teachers, more nurses, more counselors, more bus drivers, all of them. Those are the things they talked about. But Carol, when you were talking about complexities, and I'll stop here, it is not just that. Aretha taught us how to spell respect. But until we actually know what respect is for this profession, Dan, we're going to continue to lose our educators every single month. And where will we be? Where will we be, America? Where will we be?
That's a great point, Becky. Carol, I want to go back to something else you said earlier. You brought up the critical race theory issue. And I'm sure Becky's aware, we're all aware of the fact that a lot of teachers now are afraid to teach history. They're afraid to acknowledge the inequity that exists in our schools. They're afraid to talk that actually prejudice exists, that there is systemic racism perhaps in our system. They're afraid to do that, to move forward. How do we deal with this?
Well, I want to address that, but I'd also like to just briefly respond to your earlier question and Becky's comments. And I want to say, Becky, it's an equal and honor to be here with you. We have to get together after this. But the one of the reasons that teachers are experiencing this trauma, particularly during this pandemic, is that problems that already existed have been heightened. The knowledge, one of the things that we undervalue in this country is the complexity of the knowledge base that teachers need. So, for example, I was saying two of my little grandkids who were here, they just left, and the 3-year-old was about to get 4, and he get angry with his sister about something, and he just started having a meltdown, etc. There's a knowledge that I'm bringing both from my love of him, but also my knowledge of the developmental processes of 3-year-olds that I don't take seriously his screaming and hollering and jumping up and down. I have resources available to me to try to understand and contextualize the behaviors that I'm seeing. So if you think about this in relationship to teaching, you've got to manage behaviors, emotional states of children, the nature of complex knowledge that you're trying to teach. And during this time, when we had all these challenges in remote learning, kids coming back because of unequal access to lots of things during the remote learning, where they're quote unquote behind, and we have all this stuff in the media, kids being a year behind, 2 years behind. Nobody even knows what that means. But I'm trying to both remediate and accelerate, because I've got this assessment coming at the end of the year, with a set of expectations. I got a pretty complex plate to put the handle on. And so the issue of creating working conditions for the profession that also anticipate the social, emotional, and intellective developmental needs of teachers. And with the understanding, I always say that teaching is like parenting. You never get perfect at it. It is a lifelong process, right? I've got children in their 40s and 50s right now, and I'm still figuring out, wrestling with them at that particular age of their development. And we don't provide the holistic kinds of supports that teachers need. If we take medicine as one example, you can't simply have a degree in biology and then pop up and go out and start practicing medicine, right? I use my oldest son, who's a civil engineer, graduated from Northwestern University. When he graduated, he took his exam, but he could not be licensed until he had worked, 3 or 4 years under a licensed engineer. So I'm just saying there's a complex, that what we need to do to support our teachers and our children is not like we don't know. It's not like a mystery. It's not like there are not examples around the world of how to do it. It's about, in some sense, the will that we have. And this may relate to your questions around this issue of critical race theory. One of the things we have argued in this civics report, and I would again encourage everyone to go and download it. There's an executive summary. The report's long, but the executive summary is short. And we are in the process of creating some practitioner briefs specifically for teachers in each content area. So what does it mean to prepare kids for civic reasoning and debate, discourse in math, in science, in literacy, and equally in social studies? That in order for this democracy to be sustained, and we assume, if you think back, it's really important to remember with the rise of Nazism and fascism in Germany, that Hitler was democratically elected, right? It wasn't a coup, a military coup. He was elected. And there were forces at work. There were belief systems that had not been interrogated, that allowed this fascism to rise. So we don't need to have some magical notion that somehow this wonderful experiment we have can never be tested. It's always tested. And in order to interrogate it, in order to understand it, in order to facilitate it, you have to be grounded in all of the realities of the history, both the ways in which we have maintained structures of oppression for a whole variety of groups. There's a book called When the Irish Became White. I could go off, we don't have time for me to get off on this whole notion of this construct of race. You had the eugenics movement in the early part of the 20th century, where the psychologists would sit at Ellis Island, and the people who came off the boat from Eastern Europe, or Jews who came off the boat, and they gave them this 5-minute IQ test and said, they're morons, we need to send them back, we don't need them. This has been a consistent problem, and unfortunately it's not isolated to any one group of people. And part of, I think, understanding the fullness of that history allows us to know that we have had in our history groups who have faced persistent structural inequalities, some who faced structural inequalities at particular moments in time, but we have had structures of governance, which when they are taken up by active citizens, that have allowed us to push the boundaries of that and move past that. And that's why the teaching of this history is so important, not as stories of failure, but as stories of that arc slowly moving up because people are engaged.
Thank you for that, Carol. Let me at this point recognize the Honorable Bobby Scott, who has represented Virginia's 3rd Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives since 1993, and he now serves as the chairman of the Committee on Education and Labor, and also on the Committee on the Budget.
Hi, I'm Congressman Bobby Scott of Virginia's 3rd District, and I chair the House Committee on Education and Labor. This week, we celebrate Public Schools Week. The COVID-19 pandemic has underscored how important public schools are to our children, our families, and our nation's prosperity. Every year, public schools provide more than 50 million children with a quality education, social and emotional learning, healthy nutrition, and consistency that allows students to thrive. And just as importantly, educators and school staff look out for our children's well-being so parents can go to work. As superintendents, you've been handed a difficult challenge of working with public health experts, students, parents, educators, and school staff to adapt these essential services and provide students with high-quality education amid the pandemic. So as chairman, I'm here to support you and the schools you serve, not just with words, but with actions. For example, last year, Congress passed President Biden's American Rescue Plan, which delivered an historic $130 billion to help schools reopen safely, stay open safely, and make up for lost learning time. This was the largest one-time federal investment in K-12 education in our nation's history. And additionally, the funding was allocated using the Title I-A formula so that the greatest resources went to communities with the greatest needs. School leaders across the country have told us that these resources are helping them to implement school-based COVID-19 testing, upgrade ventilation systems to reduce the spread of the virus, hire additional teachers and bus drivers to reduce capacity in classrooms and buses, and purchase PPE for students and staff. The rescue plan also requires that at least 20% of the funding go towards strategies to address learning loss and close the achievement gaps through initiatives such as extending school days, offering comprehensive after-school programs and summer programs, and hiring counselors to help students cope with the impact that the pandemic has had on their mental health. However, we know that this funding alone does not solve the challenges that you're facing. The pandemic has also exacerbated long-standing challenges facing our children, educators, and schools. So in response, the House passed the Build Back Better Act. And this bill invests in teacher and school preparation programs to address teacher shortages. It helps prevent child hunger by expanding eligibility for free school meals to nearly 9 million more children. It invests in proven apprenticeship programs that will help at-risk youth gain job experiences and create pathways for vulnerable populations. And finally, the bill lowers the cost of broadband services and expands access to devices to help students learn inside and outside of the classroom. Now it's up to the Senate to pass the bill and deliver a better future for America's children and schools. Our public school system is facing some of its most difficult challenges in recent history. The pandemic has forced school leaders to make impossible choices with imperfect information while under intense scrutiny. We appreciate everything that you're doing to support educators, school staff, and parents, and most importantly, our students. So thank you for your service to public schools and your commitment to providing all students with a quality education.
Thank you very much, Congressman Scott. So we've had a great discussion, and I think it's important before we conclude our session that we go back to why it is that we love public education. Let's face it, 90% of every child in America attends a public school, 90%. That when we hear talk about vouchers and charters and privatizing public schools and all these things, 90% of our kids are in our public schools. That's not going to change. That's never going to change. It's not going to change because of what public schools do for America. Carol, what do public schools do for America?
Public schools create a possible equal playing ground for children to learn their passions, to imagine, in many cases, worlds and experiences beyond that which they directly experience on a day-to-day basis, to enter highly specialized worlds. I think very often we don't talk enough about the wonderful opportunities really of learning in the disciplines, to read literature from a vast array of traditions, to be able to enter worlds that are different from one's own, to step back in the past and imagine that one is there, to explore, the physical and natural world through the sciences. These are experiences that you have in schooling. You don't have them necessarily on the playground and other places. An opportunity to often develop cohort relationships, particularly when kids are able to stay in stable neighborhood schools where you have sort of the same cohort of friends going from one grade to the next. And often, I think I often talk in audiences and ask people to think back on what teachers they remember. And almost everyone can tell you of, at least one or more teachers who they can be in their 30s, 40s, or 50s, but they still remember that person and the difference that human being made in their lives. There are lots of, private homeschooling, et cetera, opportunities for people who elect that route for their children, but those routes, I don't think, provide the kind of opportunities that public education provides for the children themselves. But equally important, as I continue to say, is that public education plays perhaps the most special role in the society at large, because it is through education that we prepare young people for citizenship. And I want to say citizenship in the broad terms, because we have children in our schools, in public schools, who are not officially legal citizens, if you will, who are undocumented, but they still have that opportunity because living in the nation state, you can look at the work of undocumented young adults right now in the political system, that this wonderful democratic design experiment that we have makes possible through the contributions of public education.
Thank you, Carol, for those remarks. Becky, like you, I was a elementary classroom teacher, actually, and not for the years that you've been, but I was in a classroom. And to your point that you made earlier, none of us went into education to make money. We went into education because we care and we love kids. And one of the biggest rewards about being a teacher, and I remember even for the brief period of time that I was a classroom teacher, getting notes from my students telling me the difference that I had made in their lives. Share with us that experience, because I'm sure you've had many.
I have, Dan, and I call it my smile file, and I kept it for over 30 years, and I still have it. It was always a good reminder, because teaching on its best day, as Carol said before, it's complex and it takes a lot out of you. You're continuously challenged with both nurturing every individual student and then creating that community together. And something Carol said earlier, about the social and social and emotional learning that many people are just starting to hear about. And one of the things I wanted to add to what she said was that we have so much information now about the science of learning. And we understand much more than we used to, and we're continuing to learn as educators. And one of the things that we know is it's not only that we must attend to the social and emotional well-being of our students, but we actually have to think about how we integrate what we do with our students and how they learn it, what they learn and when they learn it, in a way that reflects that it is the social, emotional, and academic learning of our students that we must know about, and we must know how, through our pedagogical skills, to integrate that in a way that actually accelerates their learning and helps us build that foundation for every student so they can become those critical thinkers, those problem solvers that we need them to be. When I think about the role that public education plays in our society, Carol really gave us a stark example of our history. You know, my dad, Dan, was a history teacher, and he continuously reminded, if we didn't know our history, not only we were doomed to repeat it, the worst parts of it, but that we wouldn't continue to learn what we must to make this a more perfect union. So when I think about the role that public education plays, one of the things that I had the opportunity to do was to join in with many of our LFA partners and others to talk about the role of public education in our society, that we are focused on making sure that every student is supported and prepared for the next journey, whether it's in grade or grade level or career or college or their civic responsibility for leadership so they can be those leaders of a just society. We have to prepare them so they're able to fulfill their fullest potential as empowered individuals, as constructive members of our communities, productive participants in our community, engaged citizens, to Carol's point, not only of the US, but the entire world. And so when we think about that role that public education uniquely plays in one system of all of these systems that for our students are intertwined, it is our responsibility to understand that those of us who are in public education, that we must bring all of those other systems in, that we understand that as a society, it is our shared responsibility. We can't do it by ourselves. It's our shared responsibility, because those systems are compounding on our students to either increase those injustices or, as a society, to address those injustices as we work collaboratively and collectively as a society to live up to those words, those first words of our Constitution: we the people. We the people. It's we the people, all of us. Public education is the foundation of that.
Well, I want to thank our two guests, Becky Pringle and Carol Lee, for this wonderful conversation, Secretary Cardona for his message, as well as House Speaker Scott for joining us this afternoon. You can tell why we love public education. And I think this week it's important that all of us do everything that we can to acknowledge it, to support it as we move forward. Public education, as we have heard, is so critical to our democracy, so critical for our children. And we have great educators out there who also need support now more than ever. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing more of you during this coming public school week. Thank you and goodbye.